Snow fell softly over the Christmas fair, turning the cobblestone square into a living painting of light and shadow. Lanterns glowed amber beneath wooden stalls, ribbons fluttered in the winter air, and the sound of distant bells mixed with laughter and music. Carriages waited at the edge of the square, while townspeople wandered with warm cups in their hands, faces pink from the cold and joy. It was a night meant for miracles, though no one there yet knew how true that would become. Among the crowd walked a young woman wrapped in a faded cloak, her steps careful, her breath shallow. Her name was Eliza, and every movement cost her more strength than she dared to show. She had not come for pleasure but necessity, hoping to sell the last of her embroidered handkerchiefs before winter deepened its grip. Eliza paused near a stall decorated with pine branches and red bows, the lights reflecting in her tired eyes. The cold gnawed at her bones, yet she forced a smile for passing customers, lifting her small basket as if it were filled with treasures rather than the final pieces of her work. She had once dreamed of a life brighter than this, but illness and loss had narrowed her world to survival alone. Tonight, however, something felt different, as if the air itself carried a promise she did not understand. She took a step forward, then another, her vision blurring as dizziness washed over her like a sudden wave. Across the square, the Duke of Ravensmere moved through the fair with quiet restraint. Tall, dark-haired, and composed, he wore a long black coat trimmed with fur, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. Though many recognized him, few dared approach, for he carried himself with the distance of a man long accustomed to solitude. He had come at the insistence of his younger cousin, who believed the fair would lift his spirits after a year marked by grief and responsibility. The Duke observed the festivities with polite interest, though his thoughts wandered elsewhere, until something caught his attention. He saw her falter. At first, it was only a subtle sway, easily lost among the crowd, but then she staggered, her basket slipping from her hands. Handkerchiefs scattered across the snow like pale petals, and Eliza's knees buckled. Gasps rippled outward as she collapsed, the lights above spinning into darkness. Without hesitation, the Duke pushed forward, his boots crunching against the ice as he reached her side before anyone else could. He knelt, lifting her carefully into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, like a bird with fragile wings. "Make way," he commanded, his voice calm yet authoritative. The crowd parted instinctively, and a hush fell as he carried her toward a nearby bench. He laid her down gently, removing his coat to cover her trembling form. Her skin was cold, her lips pale, and for a moment, fear pierced his carefully guarded heart. He called for water, for help, for anything that might bring her back from the edge. When her eyes finally fluttered open, confusion clouded them, followed by a flicker of alarm as she realized where she was. "I'm sorry," she whispered, struggling to sit up. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "Please do not speak," the Duke replied softly, surprising even himself with the tenderness in his tone. "You are unwell." He noticed the thinness of her frame, the worn seams of her cloak, the quiet dignity with which she tried to regain control. This was no careless fainting, but the result of hardship endured too long in silence. Eliza tried to rise, but the world tilted again, and she clutched at the Duke's sleeve without thinking. That single touch sent an unfamiliar warmth through him, grounding him in a way he had not felt in years. He steadied her, meeting her gaze fully now. Her eyes were a deep, earnest brown, filled with both gratitude and shame. "My name is Eliza," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll be fine in a moment. I just need to go home." "Home can wait," he answered firmly. "You need care." He signaled to his cousin, who had arrived with concern etched across his face, and instructed him to fetch the family physician immediately. The Duke knew the fair was no place for recovery, and the cold only worsened her condition. A decision formed within him, swift and certain, though it defied convention and expectation. He arranged for his carriage to be brought forward and, with the physician's approval, lifted Eliza once more, settling her inside with cushions and blankets. She protested weakly, insisting she could not accept such kindness. But the Duke dismissed her objections with a gentle shake of his head. As the carriage rolled away, the lights of the Christmas fair fading behind them, Eliza's fear mingled with a strange sense of safety. She did not know this man, only that his presence felt like shelter in a storm. At the great iron gates of Ravensmere Estate, servants hurried forward, startled by the unusual arrival. The Duke issued quiet orders, his authority unquestioned, and soon Eliza was taken into a warm chamber near the east wing, far from the grandeur of the main halls. The physician examined her thoroughly, his expression grave but hopeful. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and a lingering illness had weakened her dangerously, yet with rest and nourishment she might recover. When the Duke was finally alone, standing in the shadowed corridor outside her room, he felt the weight of the night settle upon him. He had acted without thought of scandal or consequence, guided by an instinct he barely recognized. Who was this young woman who had collapsed into his life beneath the Christmas lights, stirring something long dormant within him? He gazed at the closed door, aware that whatever lay beyond it would change the careful order of his world forever. Morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the east wing, pale and golden against the heavy winter sky. Eliza stirred beneath layers of warm blankets, the unfamiliar comfort confusing her senses. The room smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood, nothing like the damp chill of her small rented room above the baker's shop. For a moment, she feared she was dreaming, but the ache in her limbs and the steady rhythm of her breathing grounded her in reality. She opened her eyes slowly, taking in the high ceiling, the carved bedposts, and the quiet crackle of a fire burning nearby. Panic fluttered in her chest as memory returned in fragments. The lights, the cold, the spinning world, and then strong arms lifting her from the snow. She pushed herself upright, wincing as weakness spread through her body. At once, a woman in a simple gray dress appeared at her side, her movements calm and practiced. "Easy now," the woman said gently. "You've been resting. The physician said you must not strain yourself." "Where am I?" Eliza asked, her voice thin but steady. "You are at Ravensmere Estate," the woman replied. "I am Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper. His Grace brought you here last night when you fell ill." Eliza's eyes widened. The Duke. Heat rushed to her face as embarrassment and disbelief tangled together. She had heard of the Duke of Ravensmere. Of course, everyone had. His lands were vast, his title ancient, and his reputation marked by reserve and quiet authority. The idea that she now lay in one of his guest rooms felt impossible. "I can't stay here," she said, attempting to swing her legs over the side of the bed. Mrs. Hawthorne placed a firm but kind hand on her arm. "You will stay until you are strong enough to leave. That is His Grace's wish." There was no judgment in her tone, only certainty. "You collapsed from exhaustion. Another night in the cold might have been very dangerous." Eliza hesitated, then slowly allowed herself to sink back against the pillows. Pride urged her to refuse, but her body betrayed her, trembling with fatigue. She closed her eyes briefly, ashamed of her weakness, then whispered, "Please tell him I am grateful and sorry." Later that morning, the Duke stood in his study, staring out at the frost-covered gardens. He had not slept. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind with unsettling clarity. The moment she fell, the way her hand had grasped his sleeve, the fragile rise and fall of her chest as she lay unconscious. He was accustomed to solving problems with logic and control, yet this was different. He had brought a stranger into his home, defying every instinct that usually guided him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His cousin, Thomas, entered, holding a cup of tea. "You look like you wrestled the night and lost," Thomas remarked lightly, though concern lingered in his eyes. The Duke accepted the tea without comment. "How is she?" "Awake," Thomas replied. "Mrs. Hawthorne says she's weak but lucid. The physician believes she'll recover if she's properly cared for." The Duke nodded. Relief passed through him, subtle but real. "Good." Thomas studied him for a moment. "You realize the talk this could cause if word spreads." "I am aware," the Duke answered coolly. but I would make the same choice again. His voice carried finality, though beneath it lay something unsettled. When Eliza next opened her eyes, the room was quiet, save for the fire and the ticking of a small clock. She sensed someone before she saw him. The Duke stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, his dark silhouette framed by the light. He turned as she stirred, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence felt heavy, charged with things unsaid. "I hope you are feeling better," he said at last, his voice measured but gentle. Eliza struggled to sit, then stopped when dizziness threatened. "I am, thanks to you," she replied. "I don't know how to repay such kindness." "There is nothing to repay," he said simply, moving closer but keeping a respectful distance. "You were in need. That is all that matters." She studied him now, taking in the composed lines of his face, the tiredness around his eyes that hinted at burdens carried alone. He did not look like the cold, distant noble she had imagined from whispered stories. "I didn't intend to trouble you," she said. "I was only trying to sell my work." "Your work?" he asked. She gestured weakly toward the small table where her basket had been placed, neatly arranged. The Duke crossed the room and picked up one of the embroidered handkerchiefs, examining the fine stitching. "You made these?" "Yes," she said softly. "I learned from my mother." "They are beautifully done," he replied, genuine admiration in his voice. He set the handkerchief down with care. "You have talent." Her cheeks warmed at the praise. "Talent doesn't keep the cold away," she said quietly, more truth than complaint. Something tightened in his chest. "You should not have been alone in such condition," he said. "Do you have family?" "No," Eliza answered after a pause. "Not anymore." The simplicity of her words carried a depth of loss he recognized all too well. He nodded, understanding more than she realized. "Then you will remain here until you are well," he said. "No arguments." She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it, sensing the futility. Instead, she said, "Thank you, Your Grace." "Please," he replied, almost sharply. "Call me Alexander." The use of his name startled them both. It slipped out before he could stop it, a small crack in the armor he had built over years. Eliza inclined her head. "Alexander," she repeated carefully, as if testing the sound. As days passed, Eliza slowly regained her strength. She was given nourishing meals, warm clothing, and the rare luxury of rest without fear. She spent hours near the window, watching the estate come alive with winter routines, servants moving like clockwork through snow-dusted paths. Sometimes, Mrs. Hawthorne sat with her, offering quiet companionship. Other times, the Duke himself visited, their conversations tentative at first, then gradually more at ease. They spoke of simple things, books, the changing seasons, the fair. Eliza learned that Alexander had lost his wife years ago, grief carving a permanent stillness into his life. He learned of her childhood in a small village, of her mother's gentle hands guiding her stitches, of dreams set aside when survival became urgent. Each shared story drew them closer, threads weaving between them unnoticed. Yet beneath the calm surface, tension simmered. Eliza was acutely aware of her place in his world, of the difference between them that no kindness could erase. She told herself daily that this was temporary, that she would leave once she was well. Still, when Alexander entered the room, her heart betrayed her, beating a little faster, hoping for reasons she did not dare name. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Alexander stood beside her at the window. "The fair will end soon," he said. "The square will return to silence." Eliza nodded. "I suppose everything beautiful is brief." "Not everything," he replied, his gaze fixed on the falling snow. "Some things endure, even if they change us." She looked at him, then, truly looked, and felt the weight of his words settle deep within her. Outside, the world lay quiet and white, but inside the estate, something fragile and powerful was beginning to awaken, unaware of the trials that awaited it. Winter deepened its hold on Ravensmere Estate, wrapping the land in silence broken only by the crunch of boots on snow and the distant call of crows across the bare fields. Eliza grew stronger with each passing day, her color returning, her steps steadier as she walked the east wing corridors under Mrs. Hawthorne's watchful eye. Yet with strength came unease. The walls that had once felt like sanctuary now reminded her of the distance between her life and Alexander's world. Gratitude had quietly transformed into something far more dangerous, something that made her chest tighten whenever she heard his measured footsteps approaching. Alexander, for his part, found his carefully ordered days shifting around her presence. He noticed the small things, how the room seemed warmer when she laughed softly at something Mrs. Hawthorne said, how the long evenings felt less heavy when Eliza sat nearby with her embroidery, the firelight catching in her hair. He told himself it was only relief at seeing her recovered, nothing more. But late at night, alone in his study, he caught himself thinking of her eyes, earnest and searching, and the way she listened as if every word mattered. One afternoon, as pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows, Alexander invited Eliza to walk in the winter garden. Wrapped in a thick cloak borrowed from the estate, she followed him along a stone path dusted with snow. The garden lay dormant, its roses trimmed back, its fountains frozen in delicate arcs of ice. It was a place of quiet beauty, and Eliza felt her breath catch. "It's peaceful," she said, "even in winter." "It was my wife's favorite place," Alexander replied without thinking. The words hung between them, heavy and unexpected. He rarely spoke of her, least of all to strangers. Eliza slowed, unsure whether she should respond. "She must have been very kind," she said at last, choosing her words with care. He nodded. She was. A pause. She believed winter was not an ending, but a promise. That everything rests so it can return stronger. Eliza smiled gently. I think she was right. They walked on in silence, the crunch of snow marking each step. Alexander felt the familiar ache of memory stir, but it was different this time. It did not hollow him out as it once had. Instead, it reminded him that he was still capable of feeling, of opening a door he had long kept shut. That realization frightened him more than loneliness ever had. As the days passed, whispers began to reach the estate. A maid spoke too freely to a cousin. A delivery boy carried rumors into town, and soon questions circled like unseen birds. Who was the young woman staying at Ravensmere? Why had the Duke brought her home from the fair? Mrs. Hawthorne did her best to quiet the talk, but Alexander knew scandal did not need truth to grow. One evening, Thomas approached him with concern etched deep into his expression. "You should be careful," he warned. "The council already watches you closely. They will not look kindly on this situation." Alexander's jaw tightened. "She was ill. I did what was right." "I know," Thomas said gently, "but they will not see it that way." That night, Alexander stood outside Eliza's room, hand raised to knock, then hesitated. He wondered if he was protecting her or selfishly holding on to a comfort he had no right to claim. When he finally knocked and entered, he found her seated by the fire, sewing with careful concentration. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, looking up. He closed the door behind him. "There are things you should know," he said. "People are beginning to talk." Eliza's hand stilled. She had sensed it, of course, in the way servants sometimes glanced at her, in the careful politeness that bordered on distance. "I never wish to cause trouble," she said quietly. "If my staying here harms you." "It is not about harm," he interrupted, then softened his tone. "It is about perception and power. I can withstand their judgment. I'm not certain you should have to." She absorbed his words, her heart sinking even as reason told her he was right. "Then I should leave," she said, the decision painful but clear. "As soon as I am able." The thought struck him like a physical blow. He nodded slowly. "If that is what you want." "It is what must be," she replied, though her voice trembled. The days that followed were strained with unspoken emotion. Eliza prepared quietly for her departure, mending her cloak, counting the small savings she had managed to keep. Alexander buried himself in estate matters, avoiding the East Wing more than he realized. When they did meet, their conversations were polite, careful, stripped of the warmth that had begun to bloom. On Eliza's final morning, snow fell again, heavier than before. She stood in the entry hall, her basket in hand, Mrs. Hawthorne pressing a small bundle of food into her arms. Take care of yourself, the housekeeper said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You will always be welcome here. Eliza thanked her, then turned to Alexander, who stood rigid near the door. For a moment, neither spoke. There were too many words, all of them dangerous. I will never forget what you did for me, Eliza said at last. You gave me more than health. You gave me hope. He inclined his head, unable to trust his voice. I wish you safety, he managed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. And I wish you peace. With that, she turned and walked into the falling snow. Alexander watched from the doorway until she disappeared down the long drive, the white world swallowing her slight figure. Only then did he realize how profoundly she had changed him, how empty the estate felt without her presence. Days passed. The fair ended. Life resumed its routines. Yet Alexander found no return to his former stillness. He thought of Eliza often, wondering where she had gone, whether she was warm, whether she was well. He told himself that this was for the best, that distance restored order. Still, at night, he stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered road, listening for footsteps that never came. Eliza, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild her life. Strength did not guarantee security. Work was scarce, the cold unforgiving. Yet she carried something new within her, a quiet resilience shaped by kindness she had not expected. She stitched late into the night, each careful pattern a reminder that even brief shelter could change the course of a life. Neither knew it yet, but winter was far from finished with them. Fate, stirred awake beneath the Christmas lights, was already weaving their paths together once more, preparing trials that would test not only their resolve, but the depth of what had begun to grow between them. The days after Eliza's departure settled over Ravensmere estate like a heavy fog. Alexander returned to his duties with relentless discipline, reviewing ledgers, meeting with stewards, and attending council gatherings where polite smiles masked sharp scrutiny. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, however, the quiet had grown unbearable. Rooms felt larger, corridors longer, and the east wing echoed with an absence he could not name without admitting too much. At night, sleep eluded him. He dreamed of snow and falling lights, of a woman reaching for him just as she slipped beyond his grasp. He woke with a dull ache in his chest, irritation at himself hardening into resolve. He told himself that this was merely the consequence of disruption. That time would restore balance. Yet each morning, when he passed the winter garden, he remembered Eliza's smile there, gentle and hopeful, and balance felt like a lie. Eliza, meanwhile, had returned to a small rented room at the edge of town. The space was cold, the walls thin, and the stairs steep, but it was hers. She worked tirelessly, visiting shops and market stalls with her embroidery, accepting meager payments with quiet dignity. Some days were better than others. On good days, she earned enough to eat well and warm her room. On bad days, she stitched by candlelight, fingers numb, heart heavy with exhaustion. She tried not to think of Alexander, knowing that memory could be as dangerous as hunger. But he lingered in unexpected moments. In the warmth of a borrowed cloak she still wore, in the scent of lavender that clung faintly to her basket, in the memory of a voice that had spoken her name with care. She scolded herself for foolishness. Gratitude did not equal belonging. Kindness did not erase distance. One afternoon, as Eliza crossed the square where the Christmas fair had stood only weeks before, she noticed a small crowd gathered near the fountain. Curiosity pulled her closer, and she heard raised voices, sharp and accusatory. A man stood at the center, arguing loudly with a shopkeeper, his face flushed with anger. When the shopkeeper refused him credit, the man turned his frustration outward, shoving a nearby vendor's cart. Eliza recognized him instantly. Mr. Carroway, her landlord. Her stomach tightened. She tried to slip away unnoticed, but it was too late. His eyes found her, narrowing. There you are, he snapped, pushing through the crowd. Running off again, are you? I am not running, Eliza replied calmly, though fear trembled beneath her words. I have paid what I owe. You are late, he said, jabbing a finger toward her. And patience wears thin. The crowd murmured, some sympathetic, others eager for drama. Eliza squared her shoulders. I will have the remainder by week's end. Caraway laughed harshly. You've said that before. Before she could answer, a firm voice cut through the noise. That is quite enough. The crowd parted as Thomas stepped forward, his coat dusted with snow, his expression unreadable. Eliza's breath caught. She had not seen him since leaving the estate. Interfering, are you? Caraway sneered. I am, Thomas replied coolly. If you continue to harass her publicly, you will answer to the magistrate. I believe the law is quite clear on such matters. Caraway hesitated, then scoffed. You nobles always protect your favorites. Still, he backed away, muttering curses as he went. The crowd dispersed, interest fading as quickly as it had flared. Eliza stood frozen, heart pounding. Thank you, she said finally, turning to Thomas. But you should not have. Alexander sent me. Thomas interrupted gently. Her breath caught at the sound of his name. Why? Because he worried, Thomas answered honestly. And because I insisted he should. They walked together in silence for a few moments, the winter air sharp between them. At last, Eliza spoke. I don't want to cause him trouble. You won't, Thomas said, but you're causing him something else entirely. She looked at him, confusion clouding her eyes. Restlessness, he explained. A man who has been alone too long, discovering he does not wish to be. Eliza stopped walking. He deserves peace, she said softly, not complication. Thomas studied her with a mix of sympathy and resolve. Peace is not always quiet, he said. Sometimes it is honesty. That evening, Alexander stood before the fire, holding a letter Thomas had left upon his return. The contents were brief but unsettling. Eliza was struggling. Not dangerously, but enough. Enough that doing nothing felt like failure. He clenched the paper in his fist, frustration rising. He had let her go to protect her, to protect himself, to preserve order. And yet order felt hollow without her safety assured. He remembered her words at the door. You gave me hope. What kind of man allowed hope to wither when he had the means to sustain it? Decision settled over him, heavy and certain. The next day, Alexander rode into town without announcement. The sight of his carriage drew attention immediately, whispers following him as he dismounted near the square. He walked with purpose, ignoring curious glances, until he reached the narrow street where Eliza lived. When she opened the door to her room and saw him standing there, snow clinging to his coat, disbelief stole her breath. Your Grace. Alexander, he corrected quietly. May I come in? She hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. The room was small and sparse, the cold unmistakable. He took it all in at once, jaw tightening. I should not be here, she said nervously. People will talk. They already do, he replied. That is no longer reason enough. She met his gaze, searching his face. Why are you here? Because I made a mistake, he said. The words felt dangerous, but also freeing. I thought distance would be kindness. I was wrong. Her heart raced. Alexander, I am not asking you to return to Ravensmere, he continued quickly. Not yet. I am asking for honesty. From both of us. She swallowed hard. And what honesty do you want from me? He stepped closer, careful, as if approaching something fragile. Tell me you felt nothing. Tell me that our time meant no more to you than shelter from the cold. She could not lie. Tears welled in her eyes as truth broke through fear. It meant everything, she whispered. That is why I left. Silence stretched between them, thick and trembling. Alexander exhaled slowly, relief and longing intertwining. Then let me do this properly, he said. Not as a rescuer, not as a duke. As a man who wishes to know you, openly and with respect. She shook her head faintly. Your world will never accept me. Perhaps not, he admitted. But I am no longer certain I wish to accept a world that demands I be alone. Her tears fell then, silent and unrestrained. He reached out, stopping just short of touching her cheek. Only if you wish it, he said softly. Eliza closed the distance herself, pressing her trembling hand against his. In that simple contact, something settled between them, fragile but resolute. Outside, Snow continued to fall, indifferent to titles and circumstance. Inside the small room, a promise took shape, uncertain and brave. Winter still held them in its grasp. Trials lay ahead, sharper and more public than either yet understood. But for the first time since the Christmas fair, neither felt alone beneath the weight of what was coming. The days following Alexander's visit unfolded with a cautious intensity, as though both he and Eliza were walking across thin ice, aware that one careless step could send everything shattering beneath them. They did not announce anything, did not make promises aloud, yet an unspoken understanding now existed, binding them more tightly than words ever could. Alexander returned to Ravensmere with a sense of purpose that startled even him. While Eliza remained in her small room, her heart caught between hope and fear. Alexander began visiting the town more frequently, always discreet, always unannounced. Sometimes he came in the late afternoon, bringing warm bread or fresh fruit, pretending practicality when concern drove him. Other times he simply walked with her through quieter streets, speaking of ordinary things as if they were the most precious conversations he had known. He never stayed long. He knew eyes watched him now, that every movement carried weight. Eliza noticed the change in him immediately. The careful distance he once maintained had softened, replaced by an attentiveness that made her feel both cherished and terrified. She feared the cost of his kindness, feared that when the world pushed back, she would be the one he was forced to release. Yet she could not deny the way her spirit lifted each time she heard his knock, nor the steady warmth that grew in her chest when he spoke her name. One evening, as they sat together near the river's edge, watching the slow movement of dark water beneath frost-lined banks, Alexander grew unusually quiet. Eliza sensed the shift and waited, her hands folded in her lap. "There is something you should know," he said at last. "The council has begun pressing me to remarry." Her breath caught, though she kept her gaze fixed on the river. "I suppose that was inevitable. They speak of alliances," he continued, "of stability, of duty." His jaw tightened. "They speak as though affection is a luxury I have already wasted once." Eliza forced herself to turn toward him. "And what do you say?" "I say nothing," he admitted. "Not yet." He met her eyes. "Because to speak now would be to invite a battle I am not prepared to win." The honesty in his voice steadied her, even as it frightened her. "You do not owe me defiance," she said softly. "I never asked you to stand against them." "I know," he replied. "That is precisely why this matters." The following week, the pressure intensified. Invitations arrived at Ravensmere, each more deliberate than the last, thinly veiled attempts to parade eligible women before the Duke. Alexander declined them all, citing estate business, illness, weather, any excuse that bought time. Thomas watched him closely, concern and admiration mingling in his expression. "You cannot delay forever," Thomas warned one night. "They will force the issue." "I am aware," Alexander said, "but I will not be cornered into another hollow existence." "And Eliza?" Thomas asked carefully. "What place does she hold in this future you are fighting for?" Alexander did not hesitate. The center of it. The answer lingered between them, undeniable and dangerous. Trouble found Eliza sooner than either expected. One afternoon, as she returned from delivering embroidery to a shopkeeper, she was stopped by two well-dressed women near the square. Their smiles were polite, their eyes sharp. "You are Eliza," one said. "The girl from Ravensmere." "I am not from Ravensmere," Eliza replied calmly. Nevertheless, the woman continued, "Your name is being spoken in places it does not belong." Eliza felt the familiar chill of judgment creep up her spine. "I have done nothing wrong." "That depends on who is asked," the second woman said coolly. "Men of power attract attention. Women near them attract suspicion." They left her then, their meaning clear without threat. Eliza stood frozen for a long moment before continuing on her way, her steps heavy. That night, she slept little, the weight of reality pressing down on her fragile hope. When Alexander arrived the next day, he found her quiet, withdrawn. It took little for him to sense what had happened. Anger flared in him, sharp and protective. "This is exactly what I feared," she said before he could speak. Your world is already pushing back, and mine is pushing forward, he replied. I will not let them frighten you into disappearing. She shook her head. You cannot fight every whisper. Eventually, you'll have to choose. I already have, he said firmly. She looked at him, then really looked, seeing not the Duke, but the man beneath the title. Then you must choose wisely, she said. Because if you choose me, you choose struggle. Then struggle it is, he answered without hesitation. Events moved quickly after that. A formal summons arrived from the council, requesting Alexander's presence to discuss matters of personal and political importance. The phrasing alone carried threat. He attended alone, his expression unreadable as he listened to their veiled accusations and carefully worded concerns. There are rumors, one counselor said, a woman of unclear background, receiving undue favor. I have offered help to someone in need, Alexander replied evenly. If that is now a crime, then our values have grown colder than the winter outside. Another counselor leaned forward. You are a duke. Your actions reflect upon all of us. So do yours, Alexander answered calmly. And I will not be instructed to abandon decency in the name of appearances. The meeting ended without resolution, but the warning was clear. The council would not retreat easily. That evening, Alexander went to Eliza not with comfort, but with truth. He told her everything. The pressure, the threats, the consequences that might follow if he continued defying expectation. He left nothing unspoken. When he finished, silence filled the small room. Eliza stood near the window, watching snow fall once more. They will never stop, she said quietly. Not until one of us breaks. He stepped closer. Then we must decide who that will be. She turned, tears bright in her eyes. I will not be the reason you lose everything. You are the reason I finally want something, he replied. There is a difference. She covered her face with trembling hands, emotion spilling free. I'm so tired of being strong, she confessed. Tired of always stepping aside. He gently lowered her hands, meeting her gaze. Then do not step aside. Stand with me. Outside, bells rang in the distance, marking the approach of another season. Winter's grip had begun to loosen, though cold still lingered in the air. Change was coming, whether welcomed or resisted. Eliza nodded slowly, fear and courage intertwining. Then we face it together, she said. Whatever comes. Alexander drew her into his arms, holding her not as a duke protecting a subject, but as a man holding the woman he loved, fully aware of the cost and willing to pay it. Beyond the window, snow melted into dark earth, and somewhere beneath the frozen ground, new life waited for its moment to rise. What neither of them yet knew was that the greatest test was still ahead, one that would demand not only defiance, but sacrifice, one that would reveal whether love born under Christmas lights could survive the full, unforgiving glare of the world. Spring arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as though the world itself was unsure whether it was truly welcome. Snow retreated from the fields around Ravensmere, leaving behind dark, thawing earth and the first brave shoots of green. With the change of season came a shift in the air, lighter, warmer, yet charged with uncertainty. For Alexander and Eliza, hope now walked hand in hand with consequence. Alexander's decision to stand openly beside Eliza could no longer be delayed. Secrecy had protected them for a time, but it had also allowed others to shape the narrative in their absence. Rumors grew sharper, more deliberate. Some painted Eliza as an opportunist, others as a distraction unworthy of a duke's attention. Each whisper was a small cut, and together they bled into something dangerous. Alexander called Thomas to his study one morning, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. I will present her formally, he said without preamble. Thomas stiffened. To the council? To the household first, Alexander replied. Then to the world, if need be. Thomas exhaled slowly. You know what that means. Yes, Alexander said. It means I stop reacting and start leading. That same day, Alexander sent a carriage for Eliza. Not in secret, not at dusk, but openly, in the clear light of afternoon. When the carriage arrived at her door, bearing the Ravensmere crest. Eliza's heart pounded with equal parts fear and resolve. She dressed carefully in the simplest gown she owned, smoothing the fabric with trembling hands. As the carriage rolled through the iron gates, servants paused in their work, eyes following its path. Eliza stepped down slowly, her posture straight, her expression calm. She felt every gaze like a weight, yet she did not falter. Alexander waited at the entrance, his presence steady and unmistakable. He offered her his arm, not as a gesture of protection, but of equality. Inside the great hall, Alexander addressed the household. His voice was calm, clear, and unyielding. "This is Eliza," he said. "She is here at my invitation and under my protection. You will treat her with the respect due any guest of this house." There were murmurs, restrained but unmistakable. Mrs. Hawthorne met Eliza's eyes and inclined her head slightly, a small act of loyalty that steadied her more than she could say. The days that followed tested Eliza's resolve in ways she had not anticipated. Some servants were kind, curious rather than cruel. Others were distant, their politeness edged with judgment. Eliza moved through the estate quietly, refusing to shrink, refusing to provoke. She spent time in the winter garden, now alive with early blossoms, and continued her embroidery, her hands finding peace in familiar motion. Alexander watched her closely, admiration growing with each quiet act of courage. Yet he could not shield her from everything. Invitations began to arrive, formal dinners, gatherings where her presence would be noted, weighed, judged. The first such evening loomed heavy with expectation. The dinner was held at a neighboring estate, hosted by Lord Harrington, a man known for his sharp tongue and sharper alliances. Eliza entered on Alexander's arm. Her chin lifted, her steps measured. Conversations paused. Eyes turned. The room shifted. Introductions were made, smiles exchanged. Some were sincere. Others were thinly veiled assessments. Eliza answered questions politely, never offering more than was asked, never apologizing for her place beside Alexander. Still, the strain showed. She felt like an object displayed, examined for flaws. Midway through the evening, Lady Whitcomb leaned toward her with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You must find this all quite overwhelming," she said softly. "Such a leap, from obscurity to prominence." Eliza met her gaze steadily. "Change often is," she replied, "but it is not the same as unworthiness." The woman blinked, surprised, then laughed lightly and turned away. Alexander heard the exchange and felt a fierce pride ignite within him. Not all confrontations were so easily deflected. Later that night, as they stood near the terrace doors, Lord Harrington himself approached. "You place yourself in a difficult position, Alexander," he said bluntly. "The council will not tolerate this for long." "Then they will have to adjust," Alexander replied calmly. "And if they do not?" Harrington pressed. Alexander's grip on Eliza's hand tightened, not possessively, but in silent reassurance. "Then we will see who truly holds authority." The ride home was quiet. Eliza stared out the carriage window, her reflection faint in the glass. "You should not have to fight for me," she said at last. "I'm not fighting for you," Alexander replied. "I'm fighting for my right to choose my own life." She turned toward him, emotion tightening her throat. "Those two things feel very close." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps they are." The council's response was swift. A formal notice arrived, citing concerns about Alexander's judgment and the stability of his leadership. A hearing was scheduled, thinly masked as a discussion, but heavy with threat. Alexander read the letter once, then handed it to Thomas. "They mean to make an example of you," Thomas said quietly. "Of us," Alexander corrected. Eliza overheard enough to understand the gravity of what was coming. That night, she stood alone in her room, staring at the half-packed trunk at the foot of her bed. Old instincts whispered that she should leave, that sacrifice was the cleanest solution. She had survived by stepping away before. She could do it again. When Alexander entered the room, he found her there, fingers resting on the trunk's edge. He understood instantly. "No," he said softly but firmly. I won't be the weapon they use against you, she replied. If I go, the pressure eases. And if you go, he said, they learn that threats work. She looked at him, tears shining. What if staying destroys you? Then at least it will be my choice, he answered. Not theirs. The hearing took place in the council chamber, a cold, imposing room lined with history and expectation. Eliza was not permitted to attend, a decision that infuriated Alexander but did not surprise him. He stood alone before them, composed, resolute. Questions were asked about propriety, about duty, about influence. Alexander answered each one calmly, refusing to be drawn into apology. When the insinuations sharpened, he did not flinch. You are risking division, one counselor warned. I am confronting it, Alexander replied. It already exists. I simply refuse to hide it beneath tradition. When the hearing ended, no verdict was given. Uncertainty hung in the air like a storm that had not yet broken. Alexander returned to Ravensmere exhausted but unbowed. Eliza met him at the door, searching his face. He shook his head slightly. No decision yet. That night, as they walked together through the garden, stars scattered across the darkening sky. Eliza spoke with quiet clarity. If this ends with you losing everything, your title, your estate, will you regret me? He stopped, turning to face her fully. If I lose everything but keep myself, he said, then no. She reached for his hands, grounding herself in his certainty. Then I will stay, she said. Not because you ask it, because I choose it. Spring deepened around them, blossoms opening despite late frosts, fragile yet persistent. Their love, tested and watched, stood much the same, no longer hidden, no longer innocent, but rooted firmly in choice rather than circumstance. The council would decide soon. The world would judge. And when it did, Alexander and Eliza would face it not as a duke and a woman rescued from the cold, but as two people who had refused to step aside, even when stepping aside would have been easier. The hardest part was still to come. The council's decision arrived not with ceremony, but with silence. Days passed without word, each one stretching Alexander's patience and testing Eliza's resolve. Ravensmere estate existed in a state of suspended breath, servants moving quietly, conversations lowered as if sound itself might invite disaster. Even the spring air felt tense, heavy with unspoken expectation. Eliza filled her hours with purpose, refusing to be idle prey to fear. She rose early, walking the gardens as dew clung to the grass, helping Mrs. Hawthorne organize linens, mending clothes for servants whose gratitude was hesitant but real. Slowly, subtly, perception shifted. She was no longer merely the woman from town. She was present, capable, and unfailingly kind. Not all hearts softened, but enough did to matter. Alexander watched this transformation with a mix of pride and guilt. He had invited her into a storm, and yet she stood straighter with each passing day. At night, when the estate quieted and uncertainty pressed in, they spoke honestly, of fear, of loss, of the future neither dared define too clearly. I don't need certainty, Eliza said one evening as they sat near the fire. I only need truth. You will always have that, Alexander replied, even if it costs me everything. The truth came sooner than expected. A sealed letter bearing the council's mark arrived one gray morning. Thomas brought it himself, his expression grave. Alexander took the letter without hesitation, breaking the seal as Eliza stood a few steps behind him, hands clasped tightly together. He read in silence. The council had reached its decision. Alexander would retain his title and estate, but with conditions. He was to formally distance himself from Eliza, publicly and permanently. Any continued association would be considered defiance, grounds for removal. The letter framed it as mercy. Alexander read it as threat. Eliza saw the change in his face before he spoke. What is it? She asked softly. He handed her the letter. She read it once, then again. When she finished, her shoulders sank, not in shock, but in weary understanding. This was always their move, she said quietly. Appear generous while forcing your hand. They underestimate me, Alexander replied, anger controlled but sharp. No, Eliza said gently. They understand you perfectly. That is why they chose me as the lever. The room fell silent. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, steady and relentless. Eliza inhaled deeply. Then we end this here, she said, her voice calm despite the pain threading through it. You keep your title, your people, your land. Alexander stared at her. Absolutely not. This is not surrender, she continued. This is strategy. You cannot change their world overnight, but you can survive it long enough to reshape it. And you, he demanded. What happens to you? I will survive, she answered. I always have. That is not enough, he said fiercely. I will not trade you for permission to exist. She stepped closer, placing a hand against his chest. Listen to me, she said. If you defy them now, they will destroy you slowly and publicly, and I will be blamed for every step of it. If we separate on our terms, they lose their weapon. He shook his head. I cannot lose you. You are not losing me, she whispered. You are trusting me. The words cut deeper than defiance ever could. That night, they talked until dawn. No raised voices, no bitterness, only the raw ache of love pressed against reality. When morning light crept across the floor, the decision was made. Their separation would be public, deliberate, and convincing. Within days, the announcement spread. Eliza would leave Ravensmere to pursue her own work elsewhere. Alexander would resume his duties without distraction. The council expressed satisfaction. Society breathed easier. The cost, however, was borne in private. Eliza left the estate at sunrise, not in secrecy, but without ceremony. Alexander stood on the steps as she descended, her small bag in hand, her face composed. No embrace, no lingering touch, only a brief meeting of eyes, heavy with everything unsaid. I will find you again, he murmured, so softly only she could hear. She nodded once. I will be waiting. She did not look back as she walked away. Months passed. Summer stretched across the land, golden and full. Alexander threw himself into reform, into land improvements, fair wages, education initiatives the council could not easily oppose without exposing their own hypocrisy. He earned the people's loyalty not through title, but through action. Quietly, steadily, his influence grew stronger than the council anticipated. Eliza traveled farther than she ever had before. She took work in distant towns, her embroidery gaining recognition for its precision and emotion. Eventually, a merchant offered to sponsor her work, selling it in cities she had never seen. She lived modestly, but with dignity and independence. She thought of Alexander often, though she never wrote. Letters could be intercepted. Instead, she followed news, hearing of a duke who challenged tradition with results no one could deny. 2 years passed. The council changed. Some members retired. Others were replaced. New voices rose, one shaped by a changing world. The conditions binding Alexander quietly dissolved, buried beneath new priorities and shifting power. One autumn evening, Alexander stood once more in the winter garden, now fully restored, roses climbing high, fountains flowing freely. He waited there, heart pounding with a feeling he had not allowed himself in years. Hope. Footsteps sounded on the path. Eliza stepped into the garden, older, stronger, her eyes brighter with a confidence earned, not given. She wore no borrowed cloak now, only her own well-fitted coat, her posture assured. They stopped a few feet apart. You kept your promise, she said softly. So did you, he replied. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, the weight of time and sacrifice settling gently between them. This time, Alexander said, voice steady, there will be no conditions. Eliza smiled, a real smile, full and unguarded. Then this time I stay. As autumn leaves fell around them, their hands finally met, not in secrecy, not in defiance, but in choice freely made. Love born under Christmas lights had survived winter, endured distance, and emerged not weaker, but resolute. And for the first time, the future did not ask them to step aside. It opened its doors and waited. Autumn settled fully over Ravensmere, painting the estate in gold and rust, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Eliza's return was not announced with trumpets or declarations, yet it was felt everywhere. Servants noticed the difference immediately, not in Alexander's authority, which remained firm, but in the quiet ease with which he carried it. He smiled more. He listened longer. And when Eliza walked beside him through the halls or gardens, there was no tension in his posture, no sense of defiance. Only certainty. This time, Eliza did not feel like a guest balanced on borrowed ground. She had come back by choice, with a life she had built herself and a confidence that no whisper could strip away. Her work had earned respect beyond Ravensmere, and with it, a sense of worth that did not depend on Alexander's protection. She moved through the estate not cautiously, but calmly, greeting servants by name, accepting kindness without shrinking from it. Mrs. Hawthorne embraced her openly, tears in her eyes. "You look well," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I am," Eliza replied, and meant it. Alexander watched these moments with quiet gratitude. The years apart had changed them both. Love, once fragile and reactive, now felt grounded, tested by loss and distance. Still, he knew the world would not simply forget. Acceptance had softened, but tradition did not dissolve overnight. The first true test came with an invitation. A formal gathering was announced at Ravensmere, an autumn assembly of landowners, merchants, and council representatives, old and new. It was not a demand, but it was a message. Alexander understood it clearly. "Show us what you intend." He discussed it with Eliza one evening as they walked beneath the lanterns lining the garden paths. "They will watch you closely," he said. "Every word, every gesture." She nodded. "And you?" "They will look for hesitation," he replied. "For doubt." She stopped walking and faced him. "Do you have any?" He met her gaze without flinching. "None." The night of the assembly arrived with a clear sky and a full moon. Carriages lined the drive, guests stepping down in fine coats and dresses, voices rising in polite conversation. Eliza descended the stairs on Alexander's arm, her gown elegant but understated, her posture composed. Heads turned. Conversation slowed, then resumed. Introductions were made, greetings exchanged. Some smiles were warm, others carefully neutral. Eliza felt the weight of attention, but did not let it settle inside her. She spoke when spoken to, listened when listening was wiser, and never once apologized for standing where she stood. Midway through the evening, a newly appointed counselor approached them, younger than the rest, his expression thoughtful rather than sharp. "Your Grace," he said, "and Miss Eliza, it is good to see you both." The pause before her name was noticeable, but not unkind. "Thank you," Eliza replied evenly. The counselor inclined his head. "I have heard much of your work. The Merchant Guild speaks highly of your embroidery." Eliza smiled. "I'm grateful for their support. And we," he said carefully, glancing at Alexander, "are grateful for stability." Alexander understood the subtext. He answered calmly, "Stability grows best when people are allowed to be whole." The counselor considered this, then nodded once and moved on. It was a small exchange, but it carried weight. Eliza exhaled slowly, tension easing just a fraction. Later, Thomas found them near the terrace. "You're winning them," he murmured. "Not all, but enough." Alexander replied quietly, "We are not here to win, only to live honestly." As the evening drew to a close, Alexander raised a glass. The room quieted. "I thank you for coming," he began. "Ravensmere has endured because it adapts without forgetting its principles. Tonight, I wish to be clear about mine." He paused, then continued, his voice steady. "Eliza stands beside me not as a favor, nor as a defiance, but as a partner. In life, in purpose, in the future I am building here." A murmur rippled through the room, some approving, some uncertain, none openly hostile. "This estate," Alexander added, "will be judged not by lineage alone, but by fairness, opportunity, and care for those who call it home." He lowered his glass. The moment stretched, then applause began, hesitant at first, then stronger. Eliza felt emotion rise, sharp and unexpected. She did not cry. She simply stood taller. In the weeks that followed, change took root in small, meaningful ways. Eliza began a workshop on the estate grounds, training young women in embroidery and textile work, paying them fairly, and connecting their pieces to the same merchants who had once sponsored her. Some were daughters of servants, others from nearby villages. Skill became currency. Confidence followed. Alexander supported the effort openly, allocating space and resources without framing it as charity. The council could not object without exposing themselves. Instead, they observed and learned. One afternoon, as Eliza watched the women work, laughter threading through concentration, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment settle in her chest. This was not survival. This was contribution. That evening, she and Alexander walked together through the winter garden, now glowing under soft lantern light. "Do you ever regret the years apart?" she asked. He considered the question honestly. "I regret the pain," he said, "not the becoming." She smiled. "Neither do I." A letter arrived shortly after, bearing a familiar seal. Eliza opened it with steady hands. It was from a merchant who had first sponsored her work, congratulating her on the workshop and proposing a long-term partnership, one that would bring apprentices from Ravensmere into wider markets. She showed it to Alexander. He read it, then looked at her with unmistakable pride. "You've changed more than our lives," he said. "You've changed what is possible here." She laughed softly. "You gave me shelter once. I simply learned how to build." Winter approached again, gentler this time. The estate prepared not with dread, but with anticipation. Fires laid, stores stocked, schedules set. When the first snow fell, it did not feel like a threat, but a memory. On the anniversary of the Christmas fair, Alexander and Eliza returned to the town square together. Lanterns glowed once more, bells rang, and the air carried the same scent of chestnuts and spice. They stood where fate had first crossed their paths. "You fell right there," Alexander said quietly. Eliza smiled. "And you caught me." He took her hand. "This time we stand." As snow drifted down around them, the world moved on, unconcerned with titles, indifferent to old rules. What remained was choice, made again and again, steady and deliberate. Love had not erased struggle. It had endured it, shaped by it, strengthened by it. And in the soft glow of winter lights, Alexander and Eliza walked forward together, not as a miracle of a single night, but as a promise kept across years. Winter returned to Ravensmere with a quieter strength, less harsh than before, yet still demanding respect. Snow covered the rooftops and fields, muffling sound and slowing time, as if the world itself wished to watch what would become of the changes set in motion. Inside the estate, life carried on with a new rhythm, one shaped not only by tradition, but by intention. Eliza's workshop flourished beyond expectation. What began as a small room with a handful of women grew into a structured space filled with light, looms, and steady purpose. Orders arrived from distant cities, each piece carrying the mark of Ravensmere craftsmanship. The women who worked there no longer spoke in hushed voices. They laughed, debated designs, and took pride in work that earned them independence. Word spread quickly, and with it respect. Not everyone welcomed this shift. A faction within the council, older and more rigid, grew increasingly uneasy. They could not openly oppose Alexander's reforms without appearing cruel or outdated, yet they resented the erosion of boundaries that had once kept power comfortably distant. Eliza, in their eyes, remained the symbol of that erosion. The first sign of renewed conflict came in the form of an audit. A formal notice arrived, announcing a review of Ravensmere's finances and operations, with specific attention paid to non-traditional enterprises. The language was polite. The intent was not. Alexander read the notice in silence, then folded it carefully. "They want to find fault," he said calmly. "If they cannot challenge me directly, they will attack what I support." Eliza's jaw tightened. "Then they will look at the workshop." "Yes," he replied, "and at you." For a moment, the old fear stirred, the instinct to step back, to remove herself before becoming a liability. Eliza recognized it immediately and dismissed it just as quickly. She had not come this far to disappear again. Then we prepare, she said firmly. The audit began 2 weeks later. Inspectors arrived with ledgers and sharp questions, scrutinizing wages, contracts, and resource use. Eliza met them openly, answering every inquiry with precision. Her records were meticulous, her practices fair. There was nothing to hide. Still, pressure mounted. One evening, after the inspectors had left for the day, Eliza sat alone in the workshop, staring at a half-finished piece. Doubt crept in despite her resolve. Change invited resistance. She knew that, but knowing did not make the weight easier to bear. Alexander found her there, the lantern light casting long shadows across the room. "You should rest," he said gently. She looked up. "Do you ever grow tired of standing your ground?" He considered the question. "Yes," he admitted, "but I grow more tired of regret." She smiled faintly. "Then we are alike." The inspector's report, when it came, was frustratingly inconclusive. No wrongdoing, no misuse, no cause for intervention. It was, in its own way, a victory. Yet the tension it revealed lingered, an undercurrent reminding them that progress was rarely welcomed without resistance. As winter deepened, a different challenge emerged. Alexander received news that startled even him. A neighboring estate, long mismanaged and on the brink of collapse, petitioned Ravensmere for assistance, financial guidance, resource sharing, and temporary oversight. It was an opportunity to expand influence through cooperation rather than control, aligning perfectly with Alexander's vision. But it came with risk. If you succeed, Thomas warned, you strengthen your position immensely. If you fail, they will blame your soft approach. Eliza listened carefully as they discussed it. "If you decline," she said, "nothing changes. If you accept, everything might." Alexander looked at her. "What would you do?" She answered without hesitation. "Accept. Carefully. Transparently. Change never grows by playing safe." He smiled. "I thought you might say that." They moved forward together. Eliza helped organize supply networks, connecting her workshop's trade routes with relief efforts for the neighboring lands. Women from Ravensmere trained others there, sharing skills instead of charity. Slowly, stability returned to the struggling estate, not through dominance, but partnership. The council watched closely. By early spring, the results were undeniable. Productivity rose. Unrest fell. The people prospered. What argument remained grew thin. At a council session that followed, a senior member, one who had once spoken most harshly against Alexander, rose reluctantly. "We must acknowledge," he said stiffly, "that Ravensmere's methods have merit." It was not praise, but it was surrender. That night, as rain softened the thawing ground, Alexander and Eliza stood together beneath the covered walkway of the garden. "They are running out of reasons," Eliza said quietly. "Yes," Alexander replied, "which means they will soon seek resolution." She met his gaze. "In what form?" He took her hands. "The only one they have left. Marriage." The word did not frighten her as it once might have. Still, its weight settled slowly. "Not as a bargain," she said. "Not as proof." "Never," he agreed. "Only as choice." Spring bloomed early that year, flowers breaking through the soil with stubborn beauty. The estate buzzed with life and possibility. Alexander formally announced his intention, not to the council first, but to the people of Ravensmere. He spoke plainly, without flourish. "I will marry Eliza," he said, "not to appease, not to defy, but because she is my equal in purpose and resolve. Those who stand with me in building a fairer future are welcome to stand with us." The reaction was not unanimous, but it was strong. Support outweighed dissent. The council, faced with unity they could not fracture, relented. Plans were set quietly, without excess. Eliza insisted on simplicity. Alexander agreed. As the date approached, Eliza walked once more through the town square, now bright with spring markets and laughter. She paused where she had once fallen beneath Christmas lights. The memory no longer carried fear, only gratitude. Alexander joined her, slipping his hand into hers. "We've come a long way," he said. She nodded. "And we're still standing." The road ahead would not be free of challenge. Power never surrendered completely. Tradition never vanished overnight. But together, they had learned the most important truth of all, that love, when chosen again and again in the face of consequence, became something stronger than romance. It became foundation. And as spring sunlight spilled across the square, Eliza and Alexander stepped forward toward a future no longer shaped by rescue or sacrifice, but by partnership, steady, tested, and unafraid of what the next season might bring. The announcement of the marriage did not arrive like thunder, but like a slow, steady bell, impossible to ignore, impossible to silence. Across Ravensmere and beyond its borders, people spoke the names Alexander and Eliza together now, not as rumor, but as fact. Some voices carried approval, others reluctance, a few resentment. Yet none carried the power they once had. The world had shifted too far to return easily. Preparation for the wedding unfolded with deliberate restraint. Eliza refused excess, jewels borrowed for display, or celebrations meant to impress rather than include. She wanted meaning, not spectacle. Alexander supported her without hesitation, instructing planners and council representatives alike that the ceremony would reflect the values they stood for: clarity, dignity, and shared purpose. The council attempted, quietly, to intervene. A private meeting was requested, framed as guidance. Alexander attended alone, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. The counselors spoke carefully, congratulating him, expressing cautious optimism, then drifting toward expectations. Alliances secured, appearances maintained, influence preserved. Alexander listened, then responded with calm precision. "This marriage is not a concession," he said. "It is not a tool. It is not a performance. If you wish to work with me, you will do so based on outcomes, not optics." The silence that followed was telling. The council no longer held the leverage it once believed it did. Meanwhile, Eliza faced her own reckoning. Invitations arrived addressed to Lady Ravensmere-to-be, a title she had not yet accepted in her heart. She felt its weight in unexpected ways. How people deferred too quickly. How some who once spoke freely now hesitated, unsure of where she stood. Power altered proximity. She was learning that truth from the inside. One evening, she confessed her unease to Alexander as they walked along the riverbank, moonlight reflecting off the slow-moving water. "I don't want to become distant," she said. "I don't want this life to erase who I was." He stopped and faced her fully. "Then it won't," he said. "Titles only shape those who let them." She searched his face. "And if the world expects me to change, then the world will have to adjust," he replied simply. As the wedding approached, Eliza insisted on returning briefly to the town where her journey had begun. She wanted to see the square again, not as memory, but as measure. Alexander accompanied her, discreetly, without escort. The town had changed. Shops were fuller. Children ran freely through the streets. The market thrived, fed in part by new trade routes tied to Ravensmere's expanding influence. Eliza recognized faces, vendors who had once ignored her, now greeting her warmly, not with awe, but familiarity. She stopped at the old baker's shop, the one beneath which she had once rented her narrow room. The baker, older now, smiled broadly when he recognized her. "You've done well," he said. "We've all done better," she replied. They stood quietly in the square for a moment, listening to life move around them. Eliza inhaled deeply. "This place no longer hurts," she said softly. Alexander smiled. "That is how you know you've healed." The wedding day arrived under a clear sky, spring in full bloom. The ceremony was held in the open garden at Ravensmere, not in the great hall. Chairs were arranged simply. Flowers were gathered from the estate and nearby fields. The people invited were not chosen by rank alone, but by connection: workers, teachers, merchants, counselors, neighbors. Eliza walked the path toward Alexander not in borrowed finery, but in a gown designed by women from her workshop. Clean lines, careful stitching, strength woven into beauty. When Alexander saw her, something unguarded crossed his face, a softness no title could command. They spoke vows not written by tradition, but by truth. "I choose you," Alexander said, voice steady. "Not because you made my world easier, but because you made it honest." "I choose you," Eliza replied, unflinching. "Not because you saved me, but because you stood with me when standing was hardest." There were no grand declarations beyond that. None were needed. Applause followed, not thunderous, but warm and sincere. As they turned together to face those gathered, Eliza felt something settle inside her. Not triumph, not relief, but alignment. Her life no longer felt divided between survival and belonging. It was whole. After the ceremony, the celebration unfolded like a shared breath. Food was passed freely. Music rose and fell. Conversations crossed boundaries once rigidly enforced. Alexander noticed counselors speaking with workshop apprentices. Eliza saw servants laughing openly near landowners. It was not perfection, but it was progress. Later that evening, as dusk painted the sky in fading gold, Alexander and Eliza slipped away to the edge of the garden, hands entwined. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. She considered the question honestly. "Of the future? No. Of forgetting to choose this life. Every day? A little." He squeezed her hand. "Then we remind each other." They returned to the celebration not as symbols, but as participants. In the weeks that followed, reality resumed its steady pace. Marriage did not dissolve challenges. It sharpened them. New responsibilities emerged. New expectations formed. Eliza now sat at tables where decisions shaped livelihoods. She listened more than she spoke at first, learning the currents beneath words. When she spoke, she did so with clarity, not concession. Alexander found himself changed in ways he had not predicted. Leadership felt less solitary. Doubt, when it arose, did not echo unanswered. He no longer carried the estate alone. The council, restructured and weakened by time, adapted grudgingly. Some resisted. Others embraced the shift. What mattered was that Ravensmere no longer waited for permission to move forward. 1 year after the wedding, on a winter evening softened by memory rather than fear, Alexander and Eliza returned once more to the town square beneath glowing lanterns. The fair was alive again. Music, laughter, warmth pushing back the cold. They stood where everything had begun. "You fell," Alexander said quietly. Eliza smiled and stood again. He kissed her forehead, a simple gesture, unnoticed by most, meaningful to both. Around them, life continued, indifferent to titles, unconcerned with past trials. Love had not been the miracle of a single night. It had been the courage to choose, to endure, to return, and to build. And in that choice, made again and again, Alexander and Eliza found not a perfect ending, but a future strong enough to hold whatever came next. The first year of marriage settled into Ravensmere not as a celebration that faded, but as a steady current reshaping the land from within. Life did not slow after the wedding. It deepened. Responsibilities multiplied, expectations sharpened, and with them came the quiet test that no ceremony could prepare them for. Love, Alexander learned, was not proven in vows, but in the patience of ordinary days. Eliza rose early each morning, not out of obligation but habit. She walked the estate before breakfast, speaking with gardeners, stopping by the workshop, listening more than she directed. Some still watched her carefully, measuring each decision against old assumptions. She did not resent it. Trust, she knew, was not demanded. It was earned repeatedly. Alexander watched this with admiration. She never attempted to mirror his authority or compete with it. Instead, she complimented it, asking questions others ignored, noticing quiet inefficiencies, advocating for changes that strengthened the whole rather than flattering the powerful. Where Alexander's leadership had once been solitary and rigid, it now flowed, adaptable without weakness. Not everyone welcomed this balance. Within months, tensions surfaced beyond Ravensmere's borders. Neighboring estates, long accustomed to extracting advantage through tradition and pressure, found their influence waning as Alexander and Eliza prioritized cooperation over hierarchy. Trade agreements shifted. Labor expectations changed. Those who benefited from imbalance began to resist. The resistance took shape subtly at first: delayed shipments, withdrawn support, murmured alliances forming behind closed doors. Alexander recognized the signs immediately. Power rarely retreated quietly. One evening, he spread a series of letters across his desk, his expression darkening. Eliza stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. "They are coordinating," she said calmly. "Not openly, but deliberately." "Yes," Alexander replied. "They believe we have grown complacent." She met his gaze. "Then they misunderstand us." The challenge escalated when a key supply route was abruptly restricted, threatening both the workshop's exports and essential provisions for several villages under Ravensmere's care. The justification was thin: bureaucratic delays, revised tariffs, temporary regulations. Temporary, Eliza knew, often meant leverage. The council convened urgently. Voices rose. Accusations followed. Some urged Alexander to concede quietly, to restore ease by returning to older arrangements. Others argued for forceful retaliation. Alexander listened, unreadable. When the debate stalled, Eliza spoke. "If we respond with pressure," she said evenly, "we confirm their fear. That fairness is weakness. If we respond with silence, we reward manipulation. There is a third option." The room stilled. "We make ourselves unnecessary to their control," she continued. "We reroute. We diversify. We invite participation rather than permission." A counselor scoffed. "That takes time we do not have." "Then we begin now," she replied, "and we endure the discomfort that comes with change." Alexander did not speak immediately. Then he nodded once. "Do it." What followed was not dramatic, but relentless. New routes were negotiated directly with smaller merchants, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. The workshop expanded its training, empowering apprentices to manage logistics themselves. Alexander authorized temporary relief from estate reserves to protect workers and villages during the transition. It cost them in the short term. It strengthened them permanently. The pressure campaign faltered. Those who had expected Ravensmere to fold found themselves isolated, their tactics exposed as ineffective. One by one, they returned to the table, not from generosity, but necessity. Victory, however, came with fatigue. Late one night, Eliza sat alone in the winter garden, exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. The lanterns cast soft light across the path, and for the first time in months, doubt crept in, not about their choices, but about her own endurance. Alexander found her there, coat draped over his arm. "You should be resting," he said gently. She smiled faintly. "So should you." He sat beside her, the silence between them familiar and safe. "Do you ever miss simplicity?" he asked quietly. Before every decision carried consequence. She thought of her small room, her basket, the cold that had once defined her days. "I miss clarity," she answered honestly. "Not ease." He nodded. "So do I." Their marriage, they learned, was not an escape from burden, but a shared way of carrying it. Where one faltered, the other steadied. Where doubt crept in, honesty pushed it back. The next trial came from an unexpected direction. A delegation arrived from a distant region, leaders displaced by famine and misrule, seeking guidance rather than aid. They had heard of Ravensmere's reforms, of cooperation replacing extraction, of dignity granted where obedience had once been demanded. They did not ask for charity. They asked to learn. The request unsettled the council. Teaching others meant influence without control. It meant ideas spreading beyond borders. It meant precedent. Alexander listened carefully, then turned to Eliza. "This is your language," he said quietly. "What do you think?" She met the delegation's eyes. "We will share what we know," she said, "but not as rulers, as partners. You will adapt it to your land, not replicate ours." Relief, gratitude, and disbelief crossed their faces. The program that followed was modest but deliberate: shared training, exchanged apprentices, open records. Slowly, cautiously, a network formed. Not an empire, a conversation. With it came scrutiny. Letters arrived from powerful interests, thinly veiled warnings wrapped in courtesy. Eliza read them without flinching. Alexander answered them without apology. "You are changing the balance," one letter accused. "We are correcting it," Alexander replied. As winter approached again, harsher than the last, Ravensmere stood prepared. Stores were full, routes secure, trust hard-won but real. The people endured the cold not with fear, but with resilience. On a quiet evening near the anniversary of their wedding, Alexander and Eliza returned to the winter garden. Snow fell softly, mirroring the night they had first walked there together in uncertainty. "We could have chosen easier paths," Eliza said softly. "Yes," Alexander replied, "and smaller lives." She leaned against him, contentment and weariness intertwined. "Do you think it will ever stop?" she asked. "The resistance?" He considered this carefully. "No," he said, "but I think it will change." "How so?" "It will become quieter," he answered, "because it will have less ground to stand on." They stood together beneath the falling snow, aware that the future would continue to test them, not as strangers brought together by chance, nor as lovers fighting alone against the world, but as partners shaping something larger than themselves. What they were building would outlast titles, councils, and seasons. And that, they knew, was worth every difficult step that lay ahead. Time did not pause to admire what Ravensmere had become. It pressed forward, demanding proof that the foundations Alexander and Eliza had laid were strong enough to endure strain, distance, and loss. The second winter after their marriage arrived with unusual severity, testing not ideals, but logistics, empathy, and resolve. Snowstorms closed minor routes for weeks. Livestock was lost. Several outlying villages faced shortages despite careful planning. Ravensmere responded quickly, opening reserves and coordinating relief. Yet the scale of the season strained even their preparedness. Leadership, Eliza learned, was not measured when plans succeeded, but when reality refused to cooperate. She spent days traveling between settlements, wrapped against the cold, listening to concerns that could not always be answered with immediate solutions. People did not demand miracles. They demanded honesty. Eliza gave it freely, what could be done, what could not, and what would take time. Alexander remained at the estate, coordinating supply movements, negotiating with neighboring lands, and maintaining stability within the council. Distance between them became a necessity, not a choice. Messages traveled slowly. Nights grew long. For the first time since their marriage, silence tested them. When Eliza returned from a week-long journey through the eastern villages, exhausted and frost-worn, she found Alexander waiting in the great hall long after midnight. He rose when he saw her, relief flickering across his face before restraint returned. "You should have sent word sooner," he said quietly. "I tried," she replied. "The roads—" "I know." He interrupted gently, then stopped himself. "I know." They stood facing each other, the weight of unspoken strain pressing between them. Leadership had taught them endurance, but marriage now demanded something different: vulnerability without efficiency, honesty without agenda. Eliza broke the silence first. "I felt alone," she said simply. Alexander exhaled slowly. "So did I." The admission loosened something tight between them. No blame followed, no defense, just acknowledgement. They learned that night that partnership was not only forged in action, but repaired in stillness. The winter eventually loosened its grip, leaving behind damage that would take months to mend. Some losses could not be undone. A village elder passed from illness worsened by the cold. Several families relocated permanently. Progress did not erase grief. Eliza attended the burial of the elder herself, standing among villagers without title or escort. She listened as stories were shared, as laughter followed tears. Leadership, she realized, was also presence, choosing to witness rather than delegate. Spring arrived late. With it came renewal, cautious and uneven. Fields were replanted. Trade resumed slowly. The workshop adapted, producing heavier goods for recovery rather than ornament. Eliza encouraged the shift, understanding that beauty had seasons, but survival came first. Then came the letter. It bore the seal of a distant authority, an assembly far beyond Ravensmere's immediate influence, one that had observed their reforms with growing attention. The message was formal, its tone measured. They were requested to present their model, not as advice, as evidence. The council reacted with alarm. Exposure meant scrutiny. Scrutiny invited interference. Some argued to decline politely, citing local priorities. Others saw opportunity cloaked in risk. Alexander read the letter twice, then handed it to Eliza. "This reaches beyond us," he said. "Once we step into that room, we cannot step back unchanged." She nodded slowly. "Neither can they." Preparation began immediately. Records were organized, data refined, stories chosen carefully, not to persuade, but to explain. Eliza insisted that workers, not just officials, be included in the delegation. Alexander supported her fully. The journey was long, the roads uncertain. When they arrived, the assembly hall dwarfed any space they had known. Stone columns, echoing chambers, observers who listened without revealing judgment. Alexander spoke first, laying out structures, outcomes, and accountability. His voice was steady, precise. Then Eliza spoke. She did not speak of systems alone. She spoke of dignity, of trust built slowly, of mistakes owned publicly, of the cost of change when power redistributed rather than hoarded. She spoke plainly, without embellishment. Some listened skeptically, others leaned forward. Questions followed, sharp, layered, sometimes hostile. Eliza answered without defensiveness. Alexander clarified without condescension. Together, they presented not perfection, but process. The assembly did not offer immediate endorsement. They offered observation. An independent review would follow. Visits would be scheduled, comparisons made. It was neither rejection nor acceptance. It was delay. The council back home reacted with frustration. "They are stalling," one member complained. "No," Eliza said calmly. "They are learning." The months that followed tested patience. Observers arrived, watched, asked, recorded. Some villagers resented the scrutiny. Others welcomed it. Eliza addressed concerns openly, refusing to pretend the process was painless. Alexander felt the strain in quieter ways. Nights of restless calculation, mornings burdened by the awareness that influence now extended beyond borders he could no longer fully see. Power, he realized, had a reach that demanded restraint as much as ambition. One evening, as summer settled softly over the estate, Eliza joined him on the balcony overlooking the fields. "Do you regret it?" she asked gently. Inviting the world to look, he considered the question. "I regret nothing that brings accountability," he replied. "Only what avoids it." She smiled. "Then we're aligned." They stood together, watching workers return from the fields, children running freely along the paths. The world beyond Ravensmere was watching now, measuring, questioning, learning. What Alexander and Eliza had built was no longer just theirs to protect. It was becoming a reference point. And with that came a new understanding, that leadership, once shared, could never again belong to a single place or a single pair of hands. The future was widening, and they would have to grow with it.